It was supposed to be just another stormy night, until a single father opened his door to a soldier and her 4 shivering children. He thought he was offering shelter. But what he didn't know was that the youngest child already knew who he was and why he mattered. If you believe that kindness can rewrite the past and love can come when we least expect it, this story is for you. Stay with us, and if these moments move, you don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Now let's begin with the knock that changed everything. The rain had been falling for hours. Not the gentle tapping kind that lulled you to sleep, but a cold, unrelenting downpours that slashed across the windshield like it held a grudge. Jack Callahan leaned forward in his old pickup, squinting through the streaky wiper blades as he turned off Highway 17 onto the narrow gravel lane he'd known since childhood Willow Road. The headlights lit up the gnarled trunks of the trees, casting long shadows across the muddy ruts. He was only 15 minutes from his cabin, and yet something in his chest tightened. Nights like this stirred up memories he tried hard to bury. Firelight, screams, the smoke. Always the smoke. As he rounded the bend just before the wooden bridge, something shifted in the beam of his headlights. A figure. No, several figures. Jack hit the brakes, tires skidding slightly in the mud, and leaned closer to the windshield. A woman stood there, soaked from head to toe, in a rain-darkened military jacket. One hand held a flashlight. The other rested protectively on the shoulder of a boy about 10 years old. Beside them were 3 more children, 2 girls and a younger boy, huddled together under what looked like a worn picnic blanket. The youngest girl clutched a soaked teddy bear to her chest. She was barely 5. Jack rolled down his window, rain slapping sideways into the cab. "You folks okay?" he called. The woman stepped forward cautiously. She looked exhausted, her brown hair plastered to her forehead, but her voice was steady. "Our SUV broke down about an hour back. No signal. We tried walking to town, but she glanced at the children there freezing." Jack hesitated only a second. "Climb in." There was no time to debate. He flung open the passenger side door and stepped out into the rain to help usher the kids into the back seat. The little girl with the teddy bear looked up at him with eyes too calm for her age. There was something unnerving in the way she studied his face, as if she recognized him. The woman last to climb in paused before closing the door. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse. "I'm Grace." "Grace Holloway." Jack gave a short nod. "Jack Callahan. You're lucky you're not 2 miles farther. That bridge floods. I've got a place up the road you can warm up there." As they drove, the cab filled with the scent of wet clothes, and something else, desperation maybe, or weariness. The children were quiet. The older boy sat stiffly, eyes fixed out the window. The girls whispered among themselves. And the youngest, still clutching the bear, never stopped looking at Jack through the rearview mirror. Jack's cabin came into view, warm lamplight glowing faintly through rain-slicked windows. He parked, got out, and opened the front door wide. Inside was modest 1-story with old pine floors and a wood stove in the center. A stack of firewood sat nearby. Jack quickly moved to the stove and lit it, coaxing a flame from memory and dry cedar. "You'll have to excuse the mess," he muttered. Grace gave a tired smile. After tonight, this might as well be the Ritz. He brought out towels and a worn quilt, letting the kids gather near the fire. He offered hot tea cocoa for the children. Grace helped distribute the mugs, her hands still trembling. As the heat began to do its work, the children came back to life. The oldest, Max, shared that he was 12. His younger sisters, Abby and Nora, were 10 and 8. The littlest one, the one with the bear, said nothing. Grace gently introduced her as Ellie. "She doesn't talk much," Grace explained quietly to Jack later. "She hasn't, not really, since..." Her voice trailed off and Jack didn't press. Later that night, with the kids tucked onto makeshift bedding near the fire, Grace stood beside Jack in the kitchen, her voice low. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," he replied, "but I've been out there. Nights like this can leave a mark." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to read beneath the surface. "Were you military fire department?" Jack answered, and then softer, "Used to be." A silence fell between them, not awkward, just heavy. Rain still pounded the roof. Grace turned to check on the kids. Ellie was still awake, eyes open wide, staring directly at Jack from across the room. "She hasn't taken her eyes off you since we got here," Grace murmured. Jack offered a thin smile, but the truth was it unnerved him. Not in a frightened way, but in a familiar way. Like déjà vu you couldn't place. He looked back at the girl, and in that moment she blinked, then gave the tiniest nod as if she knew something he didn't. Something passed through Jack, quick and electric, the kind of knowing you didn't earn, but that found you anyway. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant and low, like a memory too heavy to rise. The morning came gray and still, with mist hanging low over the trees behind Jack's cabin, like a shroud. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the kind that seeped into the bones and made the world feel like it hadn't fully woken up. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow that stretched across the pine floors. Jack stirred first. Years of getting up early never left you, no matter how long it had been since you'd last punched a time card or pulled on the heavy jacket with Engine 6 stitched on the back. He moved quietly, pouring water into a kettle, glancing toward the living room where 5 figures slept in the softness of quilts and exhaustion. 4 kids tucked like fallen dominoes in front of the fire, and their mother curled up on the old armchair, one boot still on arms folded over her chest. She hadn't even taken off her uniform top. He watched for a moment longer than he meant to, then turned away. Grace Holloway. He'd met dozens of soldiers back when he was still responding to base fires and emergencies, but she was different. There was something heavy in the way she held herself, even in sleep, like she was bracing for impact, even after the war had ended. The kettle hissed to life. Jack moved with practiced quiet, pouring coffee into his chipped navy mug. It was still early, he wouldn't wake them. But then a sound, a whisper of breath. Jack turned to find Ellie barefoot, clutching her teddy bear, standing in the hallway. She didn't speak. She simply walked over and sat at the kitchen table like she'd lived there her whole life. "Morning," Jack said gently. Ellie nodded but said nothing. Her eyes met his again, same as the night before. Direct, searching, too deep for 5 years old. Jack reached for a banana and peeled it halfway, placing it in front of her. "Breakfast isn't fancy here." She took it with both hands, still silent. "I've got cereal too," he offered. "Milk's not bad." Still no words, just a long look. Then soft, like it came from inside a memory, she whispered, "You smell like smoke." Jack froze. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. Just peeled her banana and took a bite as if she hadn't just dropped a line of dynamite into the quiet cabin. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Said nothing. Just poured another cup of coffee, this one for Grace, and tried not to let his hands shake. By the time Grace awoke, the kids were all stirring. Abby and Nora helped fold the quilts. Max asked where the bathroom was without making eye contact. Ellie stayed by Jack's side like a shadow. "I owe you breakfast," Grace said, rubbing her forehead as she approached the kitchen. Jack handed her the mug. "You owe me nothing." She looked at him over the rim. "No good deed goes unpunished. That's the saying, right?" "I don't believe that," Jack said quietly. Grace studied him again, brow furrowed like she was trying to map something unspoken. "You live out here alone?" Jack nodded. "Been 10 years. She didn't press. People who had walked through fire didn't ask for your story. They waited to see if you'd offer it." Jack gestured toward the back of the house. "There's a spare room. Needs a little work, but you're welcome to use it." Grace hesitated. We weren't planning on staying long. I have a sister in Montpellier. She doesn't know we're coming. But you can't get there today, Jack said gently. Roads are still washed out past the creek. Right, she murmured, setting down her mug. Of course. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things unsaid. Jack turned to open the fridge. I've got eggs, bacon, and toast, he offered. Unless someone's vegetarian, in which case you're out of luck. A soft laugh escaped Grace. Eggs sound like hope. Jack started cracking them into the skillet, comforted by the familiar hiss. The smell filled the cabin, and for a moment the place felt alive again. It had been years since the kitchen table had more than one plate on it. Years since laughter, childlike and full, had echoed down the hallway. The kids ate hungrily. Grace picked at her food, but her eyes softened watching them. You didn't ask about my husband, she said suddenly quietly. Jack didn't turn from the sink. Didn't seem like my place. He died in a fire, Grace said. Voice even. 3 years ago. On base. Some kind of electrical short in the barracks. Jack turned slowly. What branch was he? Marines, she replied. Captain Aaron Holloway. Jack went still. He knew that name. Not well, not personally, but he'd seen it on the report. He'd been there. The night of the fire. The one where they'd pulled out a single infant girl from the smoke. He still remembered cradling the baby coughing covered in ash. He never knew her name. Ellie. Jack sat down hard. Grace didn't notice. She was watching the children, her voice distant. It changed everything she said. Ellie stopped talking. Max stopped trusting. I stopped sleeping. We moved back here a year ago, tried to make it work, but then came the flood. And the job loss, and, well, then came you. Jack couldn't speak. He looked at Ellie again. Her wide, solemn eyes were locked on his face, unblinking. A cold realization settled in his gut. He hadn't just found a woman and her children in the rain. He had found a ghost from his own fire. Jack stood alone in the shed behind the cabin, his hands braced against the workbench as the steady hum of rain tapped the tin roof. Sawdust clung to his jeans. The smell of cedar and motor oil lingered like ghosts from another life. He wasn't building anything, just moving tools from one side of the bench to the other. Grace and the kids were inside, probably finishing breakfast. But he needed distance. Time to think. Time to breathe. 3 years ago, he had pulled a baby out of a fire. Her face had been smudged with ash, her hair singed at the tips. She hadn't cried. Not even once. The medic said it was a miracle. Jack had carried her out, handed her off to a soldier, and walked back into the smoke to search for others. He didn't find any. He never knew the baby survived. Never asked. Until last night, she'd only existed in the back of his mind, in dreams he didn't speak of, in the guilt he couldn't extinguish. Now she was sleeping in his living room, 5 years old, with steady eyes and a quiet presence that rattled something deep inside him. Ellie, he said the name softly under his breath, as if testing the sound against the silence. Behind him, the shed door creaked open. Jack didn't turn. I figured you'd be out here, Grace said. He ran a thumb along the edge of a chisel. I built this bench the first summer after I moved back, he said. Didn't have a plan for it. Just needed something to do with my hands. Grace stepped inside. She wore a flannel over her uniform shirt borrowed from the closet. Her hair was pulled back, damp at the ends. I know that feeling, she said. Idle hands. Dangerous thing for people who've seen too much. Jack nodded slowly. They stood in silence, the kind that's full, not empty. Grace leaned against the doorframe. Ellie used to talk a lot before the fire. She was a chatterbox, loved to sing. After that night, nothing. Just silence. At first I thought it was trauma. But sometimes, I think she's just listening to things the rest of us can't hear. Jack swallowed. She said something to me yesterday. In the kitchen. Grace looked up. She said I smelled like smoke. Grace didn't answer right away. She just folded her arms, her gaze drifting to the window fogged with rain. She has moments like that. Words that land like arrows. I never know if she's remembering something or feeling something from someone else. Jack turned toward her. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. But she doesn't do that with everyone. Only with people she feels connected to. Jack turned back to the bench. "I think she remembers me from that night." "I think you might be right." More silence. Grace walked over to a low shelf, picked up a piece of wood. "What is this toy chest?" Jack said. "Never finished it." She studied the carved corners. "Looks like you were building something that mattered." "I wasn't," he said. Voice lower. "I was trying to forget." He picked up a worn piece of sandpaper and began smoothing one of the planks. "I lost my wife and daughter in a house fire," Jack said barely above a whisper. 6 years ago, I was first on the scene. I thought I could get to them in time." Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. Just stood there, holding the silence with him. "I left the department not long after he continued. Moved out here. Started building things I'd never finish." Grace stepped closer. "You're not the only one who ran from the fire." He looked at her. She shrugged. "After Aaron died, I stayed in uniform. But I was never the same. Every salute felt like a lie. Every flag ceremony. Like something was missing. I kept moving so I wouldn't feel it." Jack nodded, understanding too well. Then she added, "But Ellie." She didn't move. She stayed still. She's been standing in the middle of that night ever since. Jack set the sandpaper down. They looked at each other, two people who had been surviving more than living, haunted more than healed. The air in the shed seemed to breathe with them. "I don't know what this is," Grace said. "This, whatever's happening between Ellie and you. But I believe it matters." Jack exhaled slowly. "I think it does, too." From the house, laughter rang out, light tentative. Abby and Nora were playing a board game near the fire. Max's voice, usually flat, rose with amusement. Ellie said nothing, but her presence could be felt like a lighthouse beam, silent but constant. Grace turned toward the door. "The roads are still closed. We can't leave today." Jack nodded. "You can stay as long as you need." Grace smiled, a small, tired thing full of gratitude. "We may need more than a few nights." Jack's voice was steady. "Then build something while you're here." Grace glanced down at the toy chest. "Maybe I will." They walked back together toward the house, the rain now a soft whisper overhead. As Jack opened the door, Ellie was sitting at the table again, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as if waiting. She looked at Jack, then at Grace, and finally, without fanfare, said in her small, even voice, "It's okay now." It was the first thing she had said all morning, and somehow everyone understood exactly what she meant. The rain stopped sometime during the night, and by morning, the forest outside Jack's cabin steamed in the soft warmth of spring sun. Water dripped from the eaves in steady plinks, and a fresh, almost sweet scent of damp earth and pine filled the air. Jack stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the low fog rise from the ground like smoke. It reminded him of the fire. Everything did, really. Even now. Behind him inside the cabin, Grace was humming. A slow, uncertain tune that might have once been a lullaby. It drifted from the kitchen, where she was rinsing out mugs and trying not to knock over the tower of cereal boxes the kids had constructed as a castle. They'd been there for 3 days now. And the silence inside Jack, the one he'd lived with for so long, was beginning to crack. He wasn't used to voices in the morning. He wasn't used to mornings that felt like something was starting instead of ending. He turned at the sound of the screen door creaking open. It was Grace wiping her hands on a towel. She had that military sharpness about her straight shoulders, hair pulled back, but there was something softer now, too. The way her eyes looked less guarded. The way her voice, when it came, wasn't clipped like before. "We're not in your way, are we?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "You've brought the place back to life." Grace smiled at that, but something in her expression wavered. What Jack asked, she hesitated. "I've been meaning to ask. Ellie keeps drawing pictures. Of you. But not just you now. You, years ago. Wearing firefighter gear." Jack felt the breath catch in his throat. She's never seen a picture of Aaron's fire. Grace continued, stepping closer. "I never showed her. But she draws you holding her. Holding her, the way I saw in my mind 100 times. And never told her about." Jack didn't speak. Grace reached into the folder she had tucked under her arm. It was a manila envelope, worn at the edges. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. A charcoal sketch. Childlike, yes, but eerily detailed. A tall man with a soot-streaked face holding a small baby wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. The baby was Ellie. There was no mistaking it. Jack's hands trembled as he held the drawing. "I was there," he said softly. 3 years ago. Base housing fire. They didn't tell me who made it out. I carried her out, but he stopped. Words refused to come. Grace folded her arms tightly. "You never knew it was Ellie." Jack shook his head. They stood in silence, the fog now nearly gone, the sun slipping through the trees in angled shafts. "I kept thinking," Grace said, "that if there had been someone, anyone, to save her, I would have known. I would have felt it. But I didn't. I thought maybe God was silent." Jack looked up. "I didn't feel like a savior," he said. "I just felt like a failure who didn't get to the others in time." Grace exhaled sharply. "Aaron died in that fire. He ran back inside for someone, maybe for her, maybe for a friend. I never knew. But before he did, he handed Ellie to someone." Jack's stomach dropped. "To me," he whispered. Grace blinked hard. "I think so." She pulled another paper from the folder. This one a letter. The handwriting was precise, blocky, familiar to her. "I found this in his things. I've read it 100 times, but today, I want you to see it." Jack took it with careful hands. "Gracie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. And I hate that. I hate leaving you to do this alone. But I need you to know there was a man in that fire. I didn't get his name. He carried Ellie like she was made of glass. He had eyes like he'd seen the end of the world and still walked back into it anyway. If you ever find him, I want you to tell him this. I saw him. I trusted him with our girl. And I believe if there's a chance, you'll find your way back to him. Because he looked like someone who was trying to come back to life too. All my love, Aaron." Jack folded the letter with shaking hands. Grace watched him. "He trusted you. And so do I." Jack couldn't speak. His chest felt hollow, full broken, and healed all at once. "He was braver than me," Jack finally said. "No," Grace whispered. "You both were brave, in different ways." From inside the cabin, Ellie's voice rang out suddenly, clear and calm. "You were there, and I remembered." It was the first full sentence she'd said in days. Jack turned, stunned. Ellie stood in the doorway, bare feet, stuffed bear in hand, her eyes locked onto his. And then, without hesitation, she walked across the porch and slipped her tiny fingers into his calloused palm. Grace blinked back tears. Jack knelt to her level. "You remembered," Ellie nodded. "You didn't let go." Jack swallowed hard. "I never meant to." And for the first time in 3 years, he felt something begin to melt inside his chest. That evening, after the dishes had been washed and the kids tucked under blankets near the hearth, Grace found herself standing in Jack's hallway, staring at a closed door. It wasn't a large cabin, just 3 bedrooms, all the same plain pine. But something about this door felt different. It hadn't been opened once since they arrived. Jack stepped up behind her. That one stayed shut for a long time. Grace turned. "What's inside?" He hesitated. "Memories. Some I asked for, some I didn't." She didn't press, not at first, but the look in her eyes, calm, steady, told him she wasn't going away either. Jack exhaled through his nose and reached for the doorknob. "You should see it." The hinges groaned as the door opened into a room preserved by time. The air was faintly sweet, like lavender and old paper. A narrow bed sat neatly made beneath the window, the quilt still bright with little hand-sewn flowers. There were drawings pinned to the wall, faded by sun, but untouched. A tiny ballerina music box sat on the nightstand, and there against the far wall was a cedar toy chest. Jack stepped in and laid a hand on the lid. "My daughter's room. Her name was Lily." Grace said nothing. "She was 5 when we lost her," he said. "Same age Ellie is now." He moved toward the bookshelf and pulled down a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. He opened it carefully, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, but never believed he'd follow through. Inside were mementos, a bracelet made of yarn, and beads. A crayon drawing labeled, "My Daddy is the bravest," and beneath them, a stack of letters. Grace watched as Jack lifted the top one and handed it to her. "I never read these. They were found in her backpack after the fire." Grace took the letter with reverence, unfolding the creased paper. "Dear Daddy, I know you're working with fire today, but please come home for dinner. Mommy said you have eyes that smile even when your face is tired. I love your eyes. Love, Lily." Grace pressed her lips together, handing the letter back without a word. Jack's voice cracked. "I carried so much guilt after that night. I was the first responder, but I wasn't fast enough. I didn't save them. Not Lily. Not my wife." "You carried everyone else," Grace said softly. "But who carried you?" Jack looked down at the box. "No one. I didn't let them." The room was quiet again, thick with the past. Grace stepped beside him and touched the lid of the toy chest. "May I open it?" she asked. He nodded. She lifted it slowly. Inside were small clothes, a ballerina slipper, a doll with one missing eye. Grace picked up a photo near the bottom. It was Jack younger, laughing with a little girl on his shoulders. His smile, broad, unguarded, was almost unrecognizable compared to the man she knew now. Grace traced the edge of the photo with her thumb. "You built this room with love." Jack nodded, and then tried to forget it. "But forgetting isn't healing," she said. "And Ellie, she doesn't remember the fire like most kids would. She remembers through feeling, through people. That kind of memory. It's sacred." He met her eyes. "I think I was meant to meet her again." Grace set the photo down and reached into her own pocket. "I think you were too," she said, handing him a folded note. "Aaron left this with his medals. I didn't know what to do with it until now." Jack unfolded the note. "If you find the man who carried our daughter, look into his eyes. You'll know. You'll know if he needs to be saved, too." Jack's throat tightened. "He believed in you," Grace said. "He gave our daughter to you, not just because you were there, but because he saw something in you. Something good." Jack stared at the note. "Why me?" he murmured. "Why did I survive when others didn't?" Grace answered without hesitation. "So you could build something from the ashes." They stood there in silence, two people holding grief in different shapes, but not alone anymore. Jack closed the box and turned to Grace. "Do you ever wonder if second chances are real?" he asked. She didn't smile, but her eyes, soft and steady, said everything. "Only when I look at you," she whispered. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and the fire burned low, Jack stood at his workbench again this time, not to sort tools or avoid thoughts, but to begin something. He pulled a plank of cherry wood across the table, measured twice, and made the first clean cut. The beginnings of a new toy chest. This one wouldn't sit closed in a forgotten room. This one would be filled with drawings and games and laughter. This one would be for Ellie. And perhaps, if the years were kind enough, for someone else too. The first time Grace took the kids into town, the air still smelled like yesterday's rain. They rode in Jack's old truck, Max up front, the girls in the back, Ellie holding her bear close. Grace sat quietly beside Jack, her eyes scanning the road, as if expecting it to change under the tires. "It's not much," Jack said as they neared the outskirts of Maple Glen. "One grocery store, a diner that still makes pie from scratch, and a hardware shop run by a guy who's been 90 for 20 years. Grace cracked a smile. "Sounds perfect." Jack glanced sideways. "You sure you're ready for this?" Grace exhaled. "We can't live in your cabin forever. People are going to wonder." "They already do," he murmured. Maple Glen was the kind of town where news traveled faster than weather. Jack had kept to himself for years. So when he was spotted at the general store with 4 kids and a woman in army boots, it didn't take long before questions started swirling like leaves in a windstorm. The first to notice was Mrs. Donnelly, a gray-haired widow who ran the bakery near the post office. She leaned out the window of her shop as Grace stepped onto the sidewalk. "You're the one staying with Jack Callahan?" she asked bluntly. Grace paused. "I am." Mrs. Donnelly squinted, then nodded slowly. "Good. He's needed someone to bring him back to the world." Grace blinked, surprised. "I thought you were going to ask if we were married." The older woman chuckled. "Oh, honey, around here we've learned not to mistake quiet for loneliness or company for scandal. You're both adults. And we've all been broken before." Grace stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Inside the store, Max stayed close to Jack, studying the way he spoke with the clerk, how he counted change by touch and rhythm. It was nothing special, and yet to Max, it was. Jack made everything seem steady. Simple. Safe. "You ever work with your hands?" Jack asked as they left the shop. Max shrugged. "Not really." "I helped my dad change a tire once." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Well, maybe it's time you learned how to use a saw." Max's eyes lit up, but he looked away too quickly for Jack to notice. Meanwhile, Ellie wandered toward the notice board outside the diner, studying a faded flyer with a dog wearing a party hat. She pointed. "His name is Rufus," came a voice behind her. Ellie turned to see an old man with a cane and a flannel coat. "He's the town's unofficial mayor," the man said with a grin. "Dog's been in more parades than the high school band." Ellie smiled just slightly, and Grace noticed. In a single afternoon, the town had opened its cautious arms. That evening, as the truck rattled back up the mountain road, Grace looked out at the forest, softened by dusk. "People here are kinder than I expected." "They've had to be," Jack said. "Everyone here's lost something. A wife, a child, a job, a home. They're not perfect. But they remember what it's like to fall." Grace nodded. "And you, Jack, kept his eyes on the road. I'm still learning how to get up." Over the next week, things began to change. Jack cleared out the spare bedroom. Grace painted the walls a soft sage green, while the kids helped Max assemble bunk beds Jack had salvaged from a neighbor's barn. They replaced the quilt on the living room couch, added a vase of daisies to the windowsill. It wasn't just temporary anymore. Jack's porch, once a place where silence lingered, now held muddy boots, a toy truck, and a drawing Ellie taped to the wall, a house with a red roof, and stick figures holding hands. One afternoon, as Jack was repairing the old fence along his property line, Pastor Brenner stopped by. He was tall, thin, and wore a denim jacket with a patch that read, "Chaplain." "I heard from Ruth Donnelly that you've got a full house," the pastor said. Jack nodded. "Unexpected tenants. She said one of them called you Dad the other day. Jack's eyebrows lifted. Did she? The pastor smiled. Well, rumor or not, we've got a community picnic coming up Sunday. You and your guests should come. The kids will enjoy it. And Grace, she could use a welcome that doesn't involve a grocery cart. Jack hesitated. I haven't been to church in a long time. We don't keep track, the pastor said gently. But sometimes the people you bring with you are the real reason you show up. Jack gave a nod. I'll think about it. That evening, he mentioned the invitation to Grace. She sat on the porch, brushing Nora's hair, while Abby and Ellie drew with chalk on the steps. A picnic sounds normal, she said. Jack chuckled. Not sure if we qualify. Grace looked at him. Maybe not. But I think we're becoming something close. Their eyes met. Not in a grand romantic moment, but in something quieter. Something real. That night when Jack walked past the kids' room, he paused. Max was asleep, one hand dangling off the side of the bunk. Nora was snoring softly. Abby curled into herself, holding her sister's hand. Ellie, however, lay awake. Her eyes met Jack's in the soft glow of the hallway light. He stepped inside and knelt beside her. Can't sleep, Ellie shook her head. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Do you like it here? He asked. She nodded. Why, Ellie turned her head toward the wall and whispered, because it feels like someone is remembering me. Jack didn't move. He didn't speak. But something inside him, some part long, buried, stirred to life. Because he knew exactly what she meant. It began with a porch light. One morning, just after sunrise, Jack stepped outside to find Ellie already sitting on the top step, her teddy bear in her lap, her eyes fixed on the yard below, as if she were waiting for something. He looked at her for a moment, then followed her gaze. In the soft light, the yard looked different. Not overgrown or worn, just lived in. There were muddy shoe prints, chalk drawings faded by rain, and a small red bicycle missing its front wheel that Max had found in the barn. A scene that a month ago would have made Jack feel like he was losing control now felt like a heartbeat. Ellie turned her head to him. Did you leave the porch light on? She asked softly. Jack nodded. Every night. Why, he crouched down beside her. So people know they can find their way back. She was quiet for a moment, then said, That's what it feels like here. He blinked. What does like we found our way back? He didn't speak, just sat beside her as the sun lifted above the trees, filling the porch with gold. Later that day, Jack brought out his tools and unwrapped a bundle of smooth cherry wood. Ellie stood close as he worked her eyes, curious, but quiet. What are you building? She asked. A toy chest, he said. For you. Her eyebrows lifted, surprised. Just me. Jack smiled. Well, maybe for your sisters too, but mostly you. She watched him for a long moment. It's okay if it's for everyone. He nodded, slowly touched by her response. You're a good big sister. Ellie didn't say anything, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. That afternoon, Grace found him sanding the edges of the chest sweat on his brow and wood shavings in his hair. You've been at this all day, she said. I used to build things because I didn't know what else to do, he answered. Now I think I finally know who I'm building for. Grace leaned against the railing. The kids adore you. He gave a humble shrug. They're easy to love. Grace tilted her head. And me? Jack froze, startled not by the question but by how naturally it had come. She wasn't teasing. She wasn't even smiling. She was just asking. I don't know, he said after a beat. Not because I haven't thought about it, but because I'm afraid if I say yes, I'll ruin the quiet. Grace looked away, her voice a murmur. Sometimes quiet can be lonely. Jack studied her face. Are you lonely? She gave a small nod. But it's a different kind now. Not empty. Just waiting. He set the sander down and stepped forward. I'm not ready for promises, he said honestly, but I'm here, and I care. That's the truth. Grace met his gaze. It's more than I've had in a long time. That night, as the children slept and the fire cracked softly in the hearth, Jack sat at the kitchen table flipping through a notebook he hadn't opened in years. Inside were sketches, some half-finished, of chairs, tables, carved signs. He paused on one, a front porch swing. Scribbled at the top were the words, "For Lily's Lullabies." He hadn't been able to build it back then. Now he picked up a pencil and added another sketch beside it. Same swing, but longer. Room for 2 kids, maybe 3. Grace came in quietly, a blanket over her shoulders. She looked at the page, then at him. That for Ellie. He nodded. And Lily. She laid a hand on his shoulder. There's room for both. Sunday came, and with it, the community picnic. Maple Glen was small, but they showed up in numbers. Families in lawn chairs, kids chasing dogs, a group of veterans setting up a grill and folding flags. When Jack arrived with Grace and the kids' conversation paused for just a breath, but it wasn't suspicion. It was curiosity. Hope, even. Jack hadn't been to a town event in over a decade, but that day he let Max pull him toward the games. He watched Nora and Abby compete in a sack race and saw Ellie standing by the lemonade stand, eyes wide with wonder at the sound of laughter. Pastor Brenner approached him later, paper plate in hand. You look different. Jack chuckled. Is that your polite way of saying I've gone soft? No, the pastor said. It's my way of saying you've come back. Jack looked over at Grace, who was talking with a group of women near the dessert table. The sunlight danced on her hair, and her laughter, soft, unguarded, floated back to him like a song he didn't know he'd missed. Maybe he had come back. Or maybe he thought he'd never really left, just waited for someone to knock. That night when they returned home, Ellie placed something in Jack's hands before heading to bed. It was a small card folded in half, written in a child's careful block letters. Dear Dad, thank you for coming back. Love, Ellie. Jack didn't cry, not then. He just left the porch light on. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a promise. The next morning, Jack found himself standing in front of the toy chest. It was nearly finished now, each edge sanded smooth, the corners, rounded for safety. The lid fitted perfectly with slow close hinges, so no small fingers would ever get pinched. He had carved a simple design along the front, a row of pine trees beneath a curved sky, and in the center, a small light like a porch lamp glowing in the night. It wasn't just for Ellie anymore, or even for Lily. It was for everything he thought he had lost, and everything that somehow, against all reason, was returning to him. And that terrified him. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Grace stepped into the workshop, wearing one of his flannel shirts tied around her waist, her hair damp from the shower, her expression quiet. You've been out here since dawn, she said. Jack nodded, still facing the chest. Didn't sleep. Why not? He hesitated, then finally turned toward her. Because I'm scared. Grace folded her arms, leaning against the doorway. Of what Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Of wanting too much. She waited. Of waking up one day, and realizing this, he gestured to the cabin. The kids' laughter, faint through the window, was all just borrowed time. Grace stepped forward, voice soft. What makes you think you don't deserve it? Jack laughed under his breath. Not bitter, just tired. I spent 6 years hiding from the world. I stopped believing in second chances. Then maybe it's time you started. He looked at her. You make it sound easy. Grace met his eyes. It's not. But loving again, Choosing again, it's not about ease. It's about courage. Jack leaned against the workbench. I'm not sure I have enough of that. You do, she said. You just forget sometimes. They stood there, the silence deep but not empty. Then Grace stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I know what fear feels like, Jack. After Aaron died, I told myself I'd never let anyone get close again. That it would be better to just focus on the kids, the routine, the mission. But then Ellie started asking questions I couldn't answer, drawing things she couldn't explain. And I realized, maybe love finds us, even when we're not looking. Jack swallowed hard. I'm not asking you to be a father tomorrow, she continued, or to promise me forever. I'm just asking you not to run. Jack looked down. His hands were trembling again. Grace reached out and gently took one of them in hers. You're allowed to be afraid, she said. But don't let fear make the choices for you. Later that afternoon, Jack drove into town alone. He told Grace he needed to pick up more hinges, but really, he needed time. He sat in his truck outside the hardware store for nearly 10 minutes before stepping inside. The old man behind the counter greeted him with a nod. Don't see you around much, he said. Jack managed a smile. Busy lately. The man smirked. That's what happens when people come into your life. Jack bought what he needed, then walked across the street to the church. He didn't plan to go in. He just stood on the steps for a while, staring at the closed double doors. They looked old, but strong, like they'd held their ground against storms. Maybe that was what he wanted to be. Maybe that was what he was afraid he wasn't. Before he left, he slipped a small envelope into the offering box by the entrance. Inside was a note, written in his careful mechanical handwriting, for the ones who carry others. Even when their own arms are tired. That evening the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting the yard in a soft, amber hue. Jack returned home to find Grace and the kids outside. Max was helping build a birdhouse. Abby and Nora were collecting pine cones. Ellie sat on the porch steps, her teddy bear beside her, watching the sky. As Jack stepped out of the truck, she ran to him not with words, but with arms wide open. He knelt as she crashed into him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. You came back, she whispered. Jack pulled her close. I'll always come back. Grace watched from the porch, eyes shining. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Jack found her in the kitchen drying mugs. I've been thinking, he said quietly. She turned, waiting. I was wrong, he continued. I said I was afraid of wanting too much. But the truth is, I'm afraid of losing again. Grace walked over, standing inches from him. Me too. They stood there, no fireworks, no sweeping declarations, just two people tired, but open. Then finally, Jack reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I'm still scared, he whispered. Grace touched his chest lightly. So am I. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a reason to back away. It felt like a reason to stay. The storm rolled in without warning. Thunder cracked in the distance, like the low groan of an old memory, and the trees bent in rhythm with the wind that whipped across the ridgeline. Rain pelted the cabin's windows, echoing faintly through the walls, like 1,000 quiet questions. Jack stood in the kitchen just after 5 a.m., coffee cooling in his hands, staring out at the soaked porch. 3 weeks ago, the sight of rain would have tightened something in his chest. It reminded him too much of what he'd lost, of what he couldn't save. But now, with the soft hum of 5 people asleep in the rooms behind him, it felt different. He didn't brace for the storm anymore. He listened to it. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Grace. She walked in, arms wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, her hair pulled back in a sleepy knot. She looked at him with a kind of softness that could only be earned, not claimed. "Storm's back," she said, rubbing her arms. Jack nodded. "Yeah, you okay?" He looked at her, then smiled. "I think so." They stood there quiet together until a sudden sound broke the calm. A knock. 3 soft raps on the front door. Jack froze. Grace's eyes darted to the porch. No one knocked at this hour, not out here. He walked to the door slowly, carefully, and opened it. There, standing in the gray half-light, was a man, older, with a trimmed white beard, a military ball cap in his hands, and eyes that had seen too much. "Are you Jack Callahan?" the man asked, voice gravelly but calm. Jack nodded, uncertain. "Yes." The man took a step forward. "I served with Aaron Holloway." Grace appeared beside Jack, her breath catching. The man looked at her, nodding with recognition and reverence. "You must be Grace." She nodded slowly. "How did you find us?" The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook. "He wrote about you," he said to Jack. "Not by name. Just, the man who carried my daughter. He said if anything happened, I'd know who to look for. He wanted to make sure you got something." He handed over the notebook. Jack took it slowly, his hands unsteady. Inside, scrawled in Aaron's distinct block handwriting, were field notes, training drills, and letters. Pages of them. Many unfinished. Some crossed out. But one stood out. Folded in thirds. Labeled, "For the man I never got to thank." Jack stepped back inside. Grace followed, holding her breath. He opened the letter with quiet hands. "I don't know your name, but I know your hands. I know the way you held my daughter when I passed her to you through the smoke. I know you didn't hesitate. That matters. I watched you disappear into that building again, even though you looked like hell already. That matters too. If I don't make it out, and if by some thread of fate you ever meet Grace or Ellie or the other kids, I want you to know something. You were enough. You were brave enough, fast enough, strong enough. The fire didn't take everything. You carried what mattered. And maybe, just maybe, you're part of what comes next." Jack's hands trembled. Grace took the letter, rereading it with tears quietly streaming down her cheeks. The man cleared his throat. "I don't mean to intrude. I just thought maybe it was time that knock came full circle." Jack looked up. "Thank you." The man nodded. Once gave a small salute to Grace, then turned and disappeared back into the storm, like a messenger who'd done his work. Grace didn't speak for a long time. She walked to the living room, sat on the edge of the couch, the letter resting in her lap. Jack followed. "That knock," she said finally, "was the last thing I heard before everything changed. The night Aaron died, I heard it. I don't even know if it was real." Jack sat beside her. "But now," she continued, voice shaking, "I think that knock wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. I just didn't know it yet." Jack leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the rain was softer now, more like a lullaby than a warning. He reached over and took her hand, not tightly, not dramatically, just enough to say, "I'm here." Grace let her head fall onto his shoulder. In the quiet, they listened, not for danger, not for ghosts, but for the sound of the world starting over. Then came the smallest voice from the hallway. Mom, it was Ellie in her pajamas, hair tangled from sleep. Grace stood and walked to her. "I heard a knock," Ellie said. Grace knelt. "So did we, sweetheart." "Was it him?" Grace paused, then smiled. "In a way, yes." Ellie thought for a moment, then asked, "Is it safe now?" Jack answered before Grace could. "Yes," he said. "It's safe now." Ellie took his hand and led them both toward the window. The rain had begun to lighten, and through the trees, the first lines of morning light began to sketch their way across the mist. For the first time in years, the knock hadn't brought loss. It had brought peace. By mid-May, the snowmelt had long vanished from the hills, and the trees along Willow Road stood full and green, their leaves flickering in the light like silent applause. The cabin, once cloaked in shadows and stillness, now hummed with signs of life. Laughter drifting through open windows, footsteps on the porch, laundry flapping from a line tied between two trees. On this particular Sunday, Jack woke to the sound of a hammer tapping against wood. He blinked against the morning light and pulled on a shirt before stepping outside. What he saw made him pause. Max was in the yard, sleeves rolled up, working beside the old maple tree. A stack of pine boards rested nearby, and Ellie sat cross-legged in the grass, sorting bolts and screws with quiet precision. Jack walked over, hands in his pockets. "What's going on here?" he asked, squinting in the light. Max looked up, nervous but proud. "You said every porch should have a bench." "Thought maybe the tree deserved one too." Jack raised an eyebrow. "The tree." Ellie nodded solemnly. "It watches over us." Jack chuckled. Fair enough. He knelt beside them. The boards were measured, cut, and arranged. Nothing fancy, but everything done with care. "Did you sketch the design?" Jack asked. Max nodded and handed over a notebook page. It was a rough drawing, but Jack could see his own influence in the pencil lines. Clean, simple, strong. "You two planning to finish this alone?" Jack asked. Max shrugged. "Figured we'd try." Jack stood and clapped his hands. "Then I guess I better teach you how to set a dowel joint." By noon, the yard was filled with the sounds of wood being joined, sanded, and sealed. Nora and Abby helped stain the boards. Grace came out with lemonade and sandwiches. Ellie supervised like a foreman in bare feet. When the bench was finished, Jack and Max carried it beneath the maple tree and set it in place. It was sturdy and beautiful in its simplicity. Max stood back and grinned. "Looks like it was always meant to be there." Jack nodded. "So do you." Grace walked over, brushing sawdust from her arms. "We should carve something into it." Jack looked at her, then at the kids. "What would we say?" They were quiet for a moment, each thinking. Then Ellie stepped forward, touching the bench's backrest. She whispered, "For those who bring light, especially after the fire." Jack felt something catch in his throat. Grace looked at him, her eyes full. "That came from the letter," she said softly. Jack nodded. And from her, he took a chisel and with careful hands began to carve the words into the wood. Each stroke felt like sealing something sacred. That afternoon, neighbors from town began to arrive more than Jack expected. Word had spread about the new family staying up on the ridge, about the man who once lived in silence, now laughing with 4 kids and a woman in uniform, about the porch light that never went off, about the bench under the maple tree. Mrs. Donnelly brought apple pie. Pastor Brenner carried folding chairs. A young couple brought lemonade, unsure if they belonged, but hoping they did. People greeted Grace with handshakes and warm eyes. They knelt to talk to the kids, asked Max about the bench, complimented Ellie's drawings. Jack watched it all unfold, like a man stepping into a life he didn't believe was still available to him. At one point, Pastor Brenner called for a moment of quiet. He stood next to the bench, resting one hand on its back. "I've served in many towns," he said, "but I've never seen healing arrive in such quiet form. It came not with speeches or headlines. It came with a knock, with open arms, with shared silence and simple kindness." He looked at Jack. "You remind us that the people who carry others are often the ones who need carrying too." Jack shifted, uncomfortable but grateful. And so today the pastor continued, "We gather not just to bless a bench, but to bless a beginning." People clapped, some softly, some with tears. Grace reached for Jack's hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Later, as twilight settled over the clearing and the guests began to leave, Ellie climbed onto the bench with her bear in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. Jack joined her, sitting in the spot beside her. She held up a new drawing, 5 stick figures beneath a tree, a wooden bench, and a little light hanging from one of the branches. Jack smiled. "That's us." Ellie nodded. "It's home." He put an arm around her shoulders. "Do you know what this bench is for?" she asked. Jack looked at her. "Tell me." "It's for people who forget they belong until someone reminds them." Jack kissed the top of her head, his voice thick. "Then let's keep reminding each other." She smiled, and for a while they just watched the fireflies dance across the grass. Inside the house, Grace lit the porch light, not because it was dark, but because some lights once lit should never go out. It began to rain again in early June. Not a storm this time, just a quiet, persistent drizzle that softened the air and made the leaves shine. The kind of rain that didn't chase people inside, but invited them to pause, breathe, and remember. Jack stood at the window, watching the droplets trace lazy paths down the glass. His hands were in his pockets, and his hair had grown a little longer. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. Grace had teased him that morning, called it his mountain philosopher look. He hadn't minded. Behind him, the house hummed with life. Nora and Abby were baking something that smelled vaguely of cinnamon and chaos. Max was in the shed, putting the final touches on a birdhouse he swore would survive Vermont's worst winters. Ellie was curled in the armchair, drawing in her sketchbook, her bear tucked neatly under one arm. And Grace was at the table writing letters by hand. Real ones, stamped and folded. Letters to friends she'd lost touch with, to fellow soldiers, who never got to hear her say she was okay now. She had started writing them the night after the picnic. Jack turned from the window and looked around the room. No part of it felt temporary anymore. Not the worn rugs, or the dented mugs, or the noise. Not even the drawings taped to the refrigerator, or the extra boots by the door. Every item, every sound, every smudge on the windows whispered, "This is a home. His home. Their home." The knock came just after dusk. This time Jack didn't flinch. He walked to the door and opened it calmly. It was Pastor Brenner rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Evening," the pastor said, voice warm. "You're soaked," Jack replied. "Worth it," the pastor grinned. "I was on my way back from visiting a family near Hollow Creek. Thought I'd stop and leave you this." He handed over a small package wrapped in brown paper. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "A donation," Brenner said with a shrug. "From the congregation. They voted last week to dedicate something in your name. But we figured you wouldn't want a plaque." Jack chuckled. "You figured right." So instead, the pastor said, tipping his hat, "We thought we'd give you the seed." When Jack unwrapped the package, he found a tin box filled with wildflower seeds and a simple note. "For the Garden of Second Chances." His throat tightened. He looked up, but the pastor was already halfway down the path, humming to himself, vanishing into the mist. That weekend, Jack and Grace tilled the corner of the yard near the bench. Ellie insisted on planting the first handful of seeds. Max read aloud the names on each packet, like a formal ceremony: Lupine, Columbine, Black-Eyed Susan. They planted them under the maple tree. Grace pressed her fingers into the damp soil and whispered, "Grow something good here." Jack whispered back, "We already are." The days lengthened, and so did the laughter. One afternoon, Jack returned from town with a surprise, a porch swing, the kind he'd once sketched for Lily, but had never finished. This one he built with Max. They installed it under the eaves, looking out toward the hills. The first time Grace sat beside him on it, she said nothing, just leaned her head against his shoulder and exhaled. That was enough. The porch light above them buzzed softly. Still on. Always on. One night in late summer, as cicadas hummed in the trees, Jack woke to find Ellie standing at the foot of his bed. He sat up, alarmed. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I had a dream." He rubbed his eyes. About what? She climbed into the bed beside him and whispered. "About when the rain comes again." Jack waited. In the dream, she said everyone was together, even the ones who were gone. They didn't say anything. They just smiled. And the rain didn't scare anyone. Jack laid back against the pillows, heart full. "That sounds like a good dream," he said. Ellie curled beside him, already drifting back to sleep. "It was," she murmured, "because it didn't feel like the end." Jack closed his eyes. "No," he whispered. "It felt like home. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a hope, I'd love to know. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It means more than you think to hear how far these quiet little stories can travel. And if you'd like more moments like this, stories that heal, that remind us, we're never too far from grace, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just an open invitation. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. In a world that moves so fast, your presence here is something we don't take for granted. Until next time, may your porch light always stay on, and may the next knock bring something beautiful.